Well, good morning. I want to welcome those of you who are here with us this morning and those of you who are tuning in online. We're so grateful to have you here with us as we do our sixth class, the final class of this series we've been calling SoulAnchor. This morning, we want to recap for just a moment the 5 anchor lines we've talked about thus far. The first week, we talked about the relentless love of God. And that relentless love we find expressed also in the listening heart of God, who is always present with the listening ear. And the same God who relentlessly loves us and listens faithfully to us understands us. And so we talked about the understanding spirit of God, who empathizes with us no matter what we're going through. And we've talked about the providential care of God, the way God takes care of us in ways that we cannot always explain, but God is faithful in every event to take care of us and to work things together for good. And last week we talked about the ultimate victory of God, the way that the promise that is given to us by God through the resurrection of Jesus changes the way we live and gives us a sense of hope and trust. It's our 5th anchor line. This morning, we're going to talk about our 6th anchor line. And this anchor line, we're calling the faithful children of God, because we believe that these are anchor lines are not just anchor lines for us, they're anchor lines for others as well. And God's ultimate desire for us is that by having a relationship with God, we would be transformed into the faithful children of God who can be an anchor line for others. And so we're excited to unpack that with you this morning and spend some time with that. But first, what we want to do is pray. So I'd like to invite you to join me in prayer. Oh God, we are grateful for your faithfulness. We are grateful for your love. And we are grateful that in all things you are an anchor for our souls. And we pray this morning as we wrap up this focus on your being our soul anchor for us, that you would continue the work you've begun in us to transform us into your likeness, to be your faithful children who can be anchor lines for the people around us in our lives and in our world who need to be reminded of your love and your care. Bless our time together this morning, God, and bless our lives that they may be a blessing to the world around us. We pray these things in the name of Jesus our Lord. Amen.
Amen. When I was still a student at ACU, I got a phone call from my father, and this was a couple of weeks before I was going to be taking my final exams for the courses I was in, and so I was already anticipating being able to go home and spend some time with the family around Christmas. I get this call from my dad, and he's silent after I answer the phone, and I try to start to have a conversation with him. He's just not giving me anything in return, and finally, through a choked voice, he starts to try to tell me that my grandfather, my mother's father, has taken his own life. And he starts to just talk about all that they're going through and all the emotions that they're struggling with. And he wished that either he could be in Abilene with me or I could be there with them. And in the middle of him talking, I hear a knock on the door. And I tell him, Dad, I need to go get the door real quick. And he said, oh, well, that's going to be John Willis. I already called him and told him about what's happened, and he wanted to be there for you. Now, John Willis, when I was in my undergraduate education, was one of my professors. I had gone on to work with him as a graduate assistant, and so we knew each other pretty well. And I was thankful to not have to be alone in that moment. And so when I opened the door and saw him standing there, as soon as I opened the door, I realized that he was crying, that he was struggling to know exactly what to say to me, and he just came into the room, he gave me a hug, and he started to ask me questions about my grandfather. He asked me to tell stories about my grandfather. And at the end of that time of sharing, he didn't say all that much. He said, look, I I know that finals are coming up and you've got a lot that you're dealing with, but I'm going to be checking in on you every day until you get to go home to be with your family. And I want you to tell me the truth when I call you and ask you how you're doing. I want to be that person for you. And he left, and I struggled with getting to sleep that night. I had a lot of frustrations, and my heart was broken, and I couldn't rest. And I remember going downstairs and going to my car, and at that very moment, as I was trying to get to my car to go to class, this young girl, 4 years old, she was the daughter of the dorm director where I worked. Her name was Casey. She saw me, and she ran up to me. And we often greeted each other and said hi to each other. And she ran up to me, and she put her arms out for me to hug her. And when I did, she noticed that I was not quite myself. And so while I was still holding her, she kind of backed up a little bit, just enough space to look me in the face, and she put her hand on my cheek, and she said, "I'm sorry that you're sad." Gave me another hug, and then I put her down, and she ran back to her father. And every day, John Willis was good to his word. Every day, he called and checked in on me, told me he was praying for me. Some days he prayed for me over the phone, and he did that until I was able to get to be with my family. And as I think back at that moment in my life, one of the most difficult experiences I've ever had, I see these two people, both of them, trying their best to comfort me. One of them, John Willis, really understanding the kind of pain I was going through. Little Casey not understanding at all, but knowing that I needed somebody to care, right? In both of those cases, they became embodiments of God's presence in the midst of that storm in my life. We're called to be those kinds of people. We're called to be people who are faithfully shaped by the heart of God in such a way where we can be there for one another when we don't have answers. Now, being shaped by the heart of God is different from knowing a lot about God, from knowing a lot about Scripture. It's having an experience with God, not just once, but over and over in our lives where we start to become more and more the kinds of people that Jesus modeled us for us that we could be. And so I want you to think for a moment, how have you been shaped by the heart of God? How have you experienced God's faithfulness in your own life? And how is that equipping you to be there for someone else when it's not a matter of words so much or explanations or having all the right answers? It's just a matter of showing up and being there and somehow embodying that care and that compassion.
You know, when we think about what it means to care for others, and we hear stories like the stories of John and Casey who cared for Jared, I think it's hard to hear those stories and not want to be like those people, not want to care for someone else just like they did. The challenge is, at least for me, often I want to be a caring person like John and Casey, but the question is, can I get past just the good intentions? And I believe firmly that caring for others who are going through trials well, shaped by the heart of God, requires more than just good intentions. You know, if you think of the story of Job for a moment, Job is this guy that if we've spent much time in church at all, we hear referenced basically now as shorthand for somebody who goes through a lot of suffering. But the truth is, like, he goes through suffering that felt like way more than just shorthand, right? Crops, livestock, family members, everything that he knew, everything that kind of anchored his life in the world felt like it was falling apart, crumbling beneath his feet. And Job has these friends who have good intentions to care for him. Now, I often miss that when I think about the story of Job, because I know that they go wrong with their caring, but they start out actually caring really well for him. Their good intentions lead them to go sit with him silently in his grief for a week. And they're not talking, they're not jabbering on, they're not trying to fix everything. They're sitting with him silently in his grief.
Yeah, but on day 8, they begin to talk.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's when things...
And everything changes. And do you want to share with us some of what they say?
Sure. Eliphaz, one of his friends, says, Job, those who plow evil and sow trouble reap it. So if you're in trouble and things are going wrong, it's on you, man. You did something. And then Bildad, who thinks he can help, says, yeah, Job, when you complain about what you're going through, when you talk about what it feels like for you to be suffering, your words are a blustering wind. In other words, I'm tired of your hot air. You need to let me be the one to take up a little bit of space here in the conversation.
That one's rough.
Zophar says, all these words to go unanswered. In other words, all these things you keep saying about God not being fair and your life falling apart and you blaming God for that, do you really expect me to just sit by and not defend God? Because surely God needs somebody to defend him if someone like Job is accusing God of not being fair. Now, I want to point out to you, as much as these statements just seem completely out of touch, as much as it would be easy for me to look at this and say, I would never say anything like this to somebody who's suffering, what we need to realize is part of what's going on here is they're using their words to explain their own understanding of God and their own understanding of how God always works in the world. They need a world, a life that is fully predictable. Mm-hmm. They need a God who always does the exact same thing so that when they're trying to figure out what's going on in life, they have this reliable way of interpreting events. Their need for life to make sense causes them to make things worse for Job. And I think as we look at our own world, when people go through difficult situations, it's not just people of faith. It's anybody who might start to talk to them. We crave a predictable world so much that we try to figure out how we can explain what somebody's going through. And I think part of why we're trying to do that is to soothe ourselves so that we believe that whatever they're having to go through, maybe it's not going to happen to us because we've cracked the code and we've figured it out and we're just going to avoid making the kinds of mistakes that they've probably made.
And yet, boy, does it go wrong. In Job 16:2, we read these words from Job himself. I've heard many things like these. All of you are sorry comforters. Another translation says miserable comforters. And here's the thing that catches me with this. They didn't set out to be miserable comforters. They didn't set out to be sorry comforters. I've never known a person who thought, oh, you know what? I want to be a sorry comforter today, right? But it happened. And it happened largely because they weren't prepared and they were so concerned about their own sense of the world that they couldn't think primarily about what he was going through in that moment. And then later on in Job, we find the words of God, who speaks in a way to challenge how the friends talk about God as someone who is entirely predictable, about whom we can be entirely certain and sure. You have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. God himself is pushing back on the idea that the world, that God is as predictable as they want him to be, as they feel like they need him to be. Because that's not actually how the world works, and that's not actually what any of them really need. What would have been better is if they would have not started talking after 7 days. The truth is, they kind of needed to be silent a little bit longer. John Mark Hicks says, a lengthy silence is better than a hasty sentence. And the trouble is, 7 days feels pretty lengthy to me, but when you read the book of Job, you realize 7 days wasn't lengthy enough. It wasn't lengthy enough.
And again, I think the hasty statements that we make, the quick go-to sentences that we tend to share. We've got to wrestle with how often we're speaking from a place of truly trying to bring comfort to them, or if we're trying to bring comfort to ourselves. Anytime somebody's suffering, and especially anytime somebody who is suffering is someone we care about, we're close to, we feel the gravitational pull of that suffering. And it starts to feel like it has the power and the potential, and it does, to drag us into it, to drag us down. And if we have a lot of people we care about in our lives, a lot of people that we feel responsible for, we start to kind of have this mental conversation with ourselves where it's like, well, I can't get stuck here with this person. I've got a lot of other things to do, a lot of other people who depend on me. I need to find a way quickly to kind of be pulled into their orbit, say something really, really comforting, really true, and that'll help them. And then I've done what I need to do, and I can focus on what it is that I feel like really, I'm most responsible for. It is incredibly difficult for us to realize when we're rushing somebody else through their grief and through their pain because we don't want to rest there with them because it hurts too much. Maybe it reminds us of something we've gone through. Maybe it reminds us of something that we're going through and we're trying not to think about it. Whatever it is that causes us to tend more to our own emotions and our own feelings more than the emotions and the feeling of the person that's hurting, we've got to find a way to be more patient, to be calm, to rest in that moment and in that space with them. It's never just a minute, it's a season when people are hurting. Do we have the strength and the patience to join them in that season? So here's what we've done each week, right? We've talked about these 5 anchor lines that hold us to the soul anchor of God. We have each week talked about ways that we can emulate God, that we can imitate God ourselves, but we want to spend the rest of our time this morning in practical advice on moving past these good intentions, but finding a way to actually be there for someone in a way that truly helps instead of trying to help in a way that actually hurts, right? And we never do that on purpose, as Keith mentioned, but it happens. So the first one, in case you're wondering, we've already been talking about it, and that is to find a way to be fully present. Right? The first task of love is to pay close attention. Can we find a way in the midst of everything going on in our life and everything that might be going on in someone else's life to be fully present? Psalm 46, which is a common verse I think most of us know, be still and know that I am God. We tend to say that to other people when they're worried, but if you read all of Psalm 46, you find that it's spoken by someone who's fully invested in the community and things are falling apart. This isn't something so much we say to somebody else as much as it's something we say to ourselves or we say together, that when we're tempted to think that we can rush past a frightening or a difficult moment, the only way we're going to be able to be present in that moment is to trust that God is with us. And maybe in learning how God is with us, we can learn how to faithfully be there for one another.
I spent some time as a college student and grad student here at ACU with Eddie Sharp, who at the time was the minister at the University Church here in Abilene. And I remember one of the things Eddie taught me early on was a simple short phrase of how to respond when people are going through trial. Hurry, hug, and hush. Eddie was kind of good with these sort of short, pithy sayings. Hurry, hug, and hush. Hurry to be there. Somehow, some way, find a way to be there. And even if distance is a problem, be there by the phone at that time. Find a way to be there. But if there's any way to be actually physically present, be there. And hug. Not everybody's a hugger, but most people in a moment of trial can use a reminder of someone's physical presence, not from a distance, not trying to kind of keep from getting sucked in, but being right there in the moment. And then finally, hush. Because in those moments, as we've been talking about for the last few minutes, it's so tempting to start saying something. And the best thing we can possibly do is just to be quiet. To be quiet and to begin to listen. And that's the second way we want to talk about actually helping others in times of trial. Listen more than you speak. Proverbs 18 says, "Those who answer before they listen are foolish and disgraceful." As Job showed us, sometimes people who answer after they listen can also be foolish and disgraceful. But the challenge in these moments where people we care about, people we love are going through trials is it's so easy to be quick to speak. But we've got to learn to listen in a way that actually helps. And there are a handful of ways that we want to share with you that we can do that. One of those is to be present in the moment. And by this, partly that means showing up physically if you can. But even more than physical presence, I want us to think about how easily distracted we are. How easily distracted we are with our own thoughts, how easily distracted we are with other things happening around us, how easily distracted we are with things on our to-do list, how easily distracted we are with other things that the person we're caring for is going through that aren't maybe central to the trial that they're experiencing in the moment. We want to find ways to be present so that we're not distracted. How many times, I can't even count the number of times I've had a phone call. This is especially troubling on phone calls where I'm talking to somebody on the phone, I'm trying to multitask while I'm on the phone, and I realize I haven't actually paid attention. It can happen also when we're sitting across from somebody. Finding a way to be present in the moment, not distracted, is incredibly important if we're going to listen in a way that helps.
Related to that, but I think another layer that we want to add to it is to be calm and steady. To be a non-anxious presence. And I'll just confess to you something you already know about me if you've been around me for 5 minutes, and that is that I run anxious. And usually if I'm behaving in a non-anxious way, I'm trying to fake it until I make it. Which is not the worst thing to do, by the way, especially in a situation when somebody else's either actual or spiritual panic starts to set in and we get caught up in it, right? Because it's not just that we might be dragged down into a moment of suffering, we might be wound up where we start to panic for them. And we may start to verbalize negative thoughts or fears that they haven't actually said out loud. And so if we're with somebody and our own reaction to it is to ramp up the emotional temperature and to start to say, well, yeah, and what's even worse. We don't want to do that. We want, and again, if we have to pretend that we're not anxious at first, then do that and say a quiet prayer to God as you listen and as you pay attention to them. Help me not be caught up in this anxiety, God. Help me truly be calm and steady. You think about Jesus sleeping in that boat in the midst of a storm. Why is Jesus able to sleep when everybody else is panicking? Well, because he trusts that God is with them in the boat, in the midst of the storm. Jesus is so non-anxious, he falls asleep. Now, I'm not advising that while somebody's speaking to you about their trouble, but it is possible for us to be the ones who embody that sense of, yeah, things really could be falling apart. But I'm here for you, and God is here for you. So let's take a breath. Let's take just a moment.
And related to that, we want to be patient and we want to be unhurried. Sometimes that patience is in a single conversation where we're just distracted maybe and we're trying to get on to the next thing. Maybe we want to help the person move along to feeling better. It's important to be patient and not rush a single conversation, but it's also important not to rush this caring relationship over time. The reality is it may not be one conversation, it may not be 5 conversations, it may not be, 6 months, it may be a year of time before somebody is at a place where they're really able to kind of work through and come to terms with what it is they're going through. And so part of what it means for us to be good listeners is not just to listen when we first hurry and hug and hush, but to listen over an extended period of time to what it is that they're saying, because they may not even articulate the deepest challenges they're facing for some time. It may take them a while to actually be able to verbalize what it is they're feeling. And so if we're able to be patient and unhurried, we can still be around and faithfully listening and hear when they finally give voice to those deepest hurts and deepest concerns.
And we've got to find a way, when we think of this idea of listening, to pay attention to more than just what the person's saying. And this is a real temptation, especially for me personally, to kind of fixate on the words that they're saying. And unfortunately, the temptation is not for me just to fixate on the words they're saying, but to fix the words they're saying, right? That if they say something that I think is not helpful, and part of it is when we go into spiritual shock, we rehearse things, right? We say things we've heard said over and over and over again. Whether we really understand what we're saying or whether we might not even really fully believe what we're saying. One of the phrases that drives me crazy when somebody's suffering is when they say, well, everything happens for a reason. And I want to say to them, the way I read my Bible, I wouldn't say everything happens for a reason. I wouldn't. And if I did say that, I would say not everything that happens is God's reason. And so if you're saying that to act like God's doing this to you to teach you something, which again is something we say, Job, just as a book, collectively says, no, God's not actually the one dismantling Job's life. That's Satan. Right? And so don't blame God for that. And these friends who are trying to speak up for God to make sense of the world, to say things are predictable. No, life isn't always predictable. There's this conversation in the Gospels that people have with Jesus, and they say, this tower fell. Did the tower fall on unjust people, or did it just fall? And Jesus basically responds and says, sometimes towers fall. You're reading meaning into things where there's not meaning because you need your life to make sense. But one of the evils we have to bear up under, right? One of the uncertainties we have to deal with is sometimes we can't make sense of it. The primary question Job asks over and over to God and to his friends is, why is this happening to me? I'm a righteous person. I've tried to live my life according to God's law. And here my life's being dismantled, and you say it's being dismantled by God. And I can't bring myself to believe that's what's happening. I don't know what's happening, but I can't believe that God is my enemy. God can't be the one doing this to me. Why is this happening to me? And finally, when you get to the end of Job, that question why, God responds by saying, here I am. Now, I don't know if you're following this, but here I am is not a logical answer to the question why. It's not a reason God gives, it's himself, it's his presence. Man, I think about that so often when I hear people say things in the midst of their difficulties where they're trying to piece things together. When I hear somebody lose a spouse and say, well, I guess God needed them more than I did. No. Or when someone loses a child and somebody tries to make sense of it and say, well, I guess God just wanted to have them there and now they're an angel. Or, you hear this kind of stuff, right? People trying to make sense of all of it. We need to be careful what we say, especially to the person who's suffering. They don't need a class on theology when their life's falling apart. That's why we did this class, by the way. Right? The best time to think about how we're going to handle suffering is before our life is dismantled by it. You can't think then, but maybe you can think now, and you can start to think ahead of time. What am I going to say to myself? What am I going to say to somebody else? How am I going to be compassionate to myself? How am I going to be compassionate to somebody else? We need to really take stock of how that person's doing, not just what they're saying, and we especially don't need to feel like we have to give them all the answers. Now, one of the ways we can do that is instead of thinking that we're the answer people, we can think of ourselves more as having the task of asking good questions. And when I say good questions in this context, I mean open-ended questions. Questions where you're not leading the witness, right? And I took a chaplaincy class, both in undergrad and in my graduate education at ACU. And so both rounds of my chaplaincy training happened at Hendrick. And so the chaplains there would regularly meet with us and instruct us and teach us. And one of the things that has stayed with me is this task of asking open-ended questions. Now, this first question, how are you feeling today? That's a more open question than it may seem like at first. I think a lot of times I've been with church folks when we go in to visit somebody who's sick in the hospital, and they start to ask them how they're doing, and they'll interrupt themselves and say, well, I guess that's a stupid question. You're in the hospital. It's not a stupid question to ask somebody who's hurting how they're doing today. Now, one of the reasons it's a really open-ended question is you're not saying, how's your soul doing today? You're not asking, how's your body feeling today? You're letting them decide what level they're going to meet you at and they're going to talk about. And you may find out right at the beginning when you ask them how they're doing, they don't want to talk about their leg, their hip, their arm, their heart. They want to talk about their relationship to God or maybe something else that's going on that has nothing to do with the hospital. You know, when people are going through moments where they have to be hospitalized, most of the challenges in their family dynamics come to the surface. I have found more often than not, when I let someone else decide how they want to respond to a simple question like, how are you doing today? They go to places I wouldn't even know how to ask them to open up and go. Where are your thoughts taking you? Same kind of question, right? They could talk about missing being at home or being around folks that they don't get to see, or they could talk about, it, depending on how serious the situation is that they find themselves in, they may want to talk about heaven. You know, they may want to talk about things that they've never asked anybody else, but now that you're with them in this moment, they want to bring it up and talk about it with you. There's also clarifying questions. I'll let you take those.
Yeah, so one of the things that's helpful is to be engaged as listeners. We don't just ask a question, let the person talk, and then move along. We want to stay engaged and have a sense of following them on a journey of thought. And so one of the great clarifying questions we can use in all kinds of situations is simply, can you tell me more about that? This is a question that's great beyond moments of trial where we're caring for people. I find it's one of the most helpful questions to ask my kids when they come home from school and they, say they had a math test today. Well, tell me more about that. When they had an interaction with a friend, tell me more about that. But it's especially helpful in times of trial where we're listening to people. It's a way for them to understand and experience that we're listening well. We're in this. We're not just doing this sort of as a formality. We really care. Can you tell me more about that? And then, while there are many others we could talk about, there's one other one I think we really want to focus on this morning, and it's this. Is there anything I can pray for specifically? Now, this question, I think, is really important for me to remember to ask folks because often, especially in times of trial, I assume I know what it is that people want me to be praying for. Stephen wants me to pray for this. Roy wants me to pray for that. Karen wants me to pray for this other thing. But the truth is, my knowledge is limited. Now, if I've been listening well, I know some stuff I can pray for, but there may be something that the person I'm talking to hasn't been willing to share yet, but they would share specifically when I ask them, what can I pray about specifically? And so keep this one in mind when you're having conversations with folks. Is there anything I can pray for specifically to let them lead the way on what you pray for, not just to assume you know?
And almost always when I ask this question, they don't want me to pray for them.
Yeah, that's true.
They want me to pray for someone else. And I never, doesn't matter how many times I've visited somebody who's suffering, I never remember that until they say, well, you know what? Who I really have been thinking about is my daughter. And this is what she's going through. And can we pray for her? It is so convicting to me that Christian people throughout their lives get shaped in such a way that even when they're suffering, they're thinking about other people. It's convicting to me every time it happens, and it helps me remember who I want to be. Okay, we want to finally kind of talk about a third way to actually help, taking caring but careful action. Right? In other words, there comes a time where we've got to do something, but we want to be really careful not to go from 0 to 60. We need to be thoughtful. We need to realize that not every situation's the same and not every person's the same, but there are some basic skills, some approaches we can take that help us do this well. In Galatians 6:2, Paul says, look, carry each other's burdens, and so you will fulfill the law of Christ. So it is possible, right, for us to actually effectively share someone's burden, to lift them up, to help carry them through what they're going through. And while we don't always have the power to make those trials go away, we can always take action so that our brothers and sisters don't have to carry those burdens all on their own. What does that look like? What do we mean when we say that? Well, the first thing, and this has gotten increasingly, I think, easy for us to do with smartphones and kind of always the ability to take notes. But the first thing, the thing that you've got to do before you forget is you mark down the anniversary of whatever the significant event is in your calendar. Because one of the most difficult things for us to do for people, for one another, is to stay in that season of suffering in effective ways. And one of the most effective ways is to help them know that on that day when they wake up and they feel the anniversary of that crisis deep in their bones, that you remember too, that this was that day a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. One of the most difficult things for people, especially when they lose someone they love, is to be afraid that that person's being forgotten. This is a simple thing to do. Set a reminder, set an anniversary. Don't wait till you get to the car. Don't wait till we live in such a distracted world. Stop what you're doing. The moment you step away from them, put it in your calendar.
And consistently reach out to make contact. One of the things that when Jared first told me about John Willis's response to his grandfather's death years ago that stood out to me so strongly is this consistent contact. Jared, I'm going to call you and check on you every day. And that consistent presence matters, especially when it feels like the world is moving on, I'm having all this pressure that I need to move on for all these other aspects of life that I can't just drop all of a sudden. That consistent presence of making contact is really, really important.
And it can become something that person is looking forward to.
Yes.
It can be what helps them get through that day is that you're going to call, you're going to text. That consistency becomes so important because everything else may be falling apart and they need something to rely on. Don't avoid talking about it. This is one of the big mistakes I tend to make. It's like I feel like I'm bringing the subject up. Look, if it's a big enough crisis in somebody's life, they never stop thinking about it. And I get it. You know, C.S. Lewis talks about, he lost his wife to an illness, and he talks about the struggle of the fact that losing her at some point became the last thing he ever wanted to talk about and the only thing he wanted to talk about. And so it was a little bit of a challenge for his friends because in some ways there was a part of Lewis that wanted to talk about anything but that crisis. And yet if he got through an interaction with his friend and they didn't bring it up, he felt like they weren't even thinking about it. And if I have to choose between, which side of this am I going to err to, I want to be the person who brings up a story. I want to be the person who, if nobody else has brought up David Varner to Cindy in a day, I bring him up. She's never not thinking about David. Right? And it makes her cry, and it's fine. Right? And it makes me at times feel like I wish I had a better answer, but you know what? All that really matters is that somebody brought David up that day. We've got to be that kind of person for one another because if we're not careful, we'll avoid talking about it. We think we're being nice, but what that person may interpret it to mean is we're not even thinking about it anymore.
We also want to be very careful with offering resources.
Especially too early.
Yeah, sometimes in these moments, our temptation is, we find out about somebody losing someone they love, and we hurry, hug, and hush and get there, and we have a book in hand, right? And books have helped me through challenging times of life, many of you as well. But we've got to be very careful about offering resources, especially too early. One of the things that will come up if we're consistently reaching out to make contact and we're not avoiding talking about the trial is people will let us know when they're ready for resources. And so be ready in those moments.
And finally, and this is really important, pay attention to what's going on enough to realize if you get the sense that someone you're talking with needs some professional assistance and help. We don't talk about this nearly enough in church. Nobody comes ready equipped to grieve the loss of a spouse or a child. Nobody's ready for that. No matter how much they think they are, they're not. And people can get to the place where they need someone who's trained in how to give them things to do and how to help them. And if we try to do that on top of being a faithful friend, we can kind of mess both sides of that up, where we're not the kind of friend they need, and we're kind of really just giving them advice that we heard somewhere, someone else say. If somebody is slipping into what feels like to you as their friend, something like depression, start asking us, ask around. We can give you resources to figure out how to help that person. And the main thing you need to help them work through is there's never shame in doing what you need to do to get healthier. There's never shame that should be attached to that. And we need to do more than just pray for people. We need to get them the kinds of help that God has put into our lives that we can offer them.
3 ways to actually help when people are going through trials. Be fully present, listen more than you speak, take caring and careful action. And hopefully these small tools that we've given you this morning will help you just as they've helped us and will continue to help us. Now, if some of you have interest in going a little bit deeper and you say, I want to learn more about these tools in greater depth and other tools that I can use to care for people, we want to help you with that. And so if you'll send me an email, keith@soulhillschurch.org, I'll get back with you and we'll explore the possibility of some small group training in how to offer pastoral care for others with even more training than what we've done here. In the meantime, we've got cards. Jared will tell you about those.
Yeah, today's Everyday Excursion card is different than the others. It includes the primary material that we've covered in such a quick amount of time here. 40 minutes is just not nearly enough time, especially to remember all of this. And so today's card summarizes those primary points. And again, if you've got any questions about that, anything you want to learn more about, email Keith. He's actually undergone some specific training in helping the rest of us learn more and more how to be helpful and not just trying to help and then we accidentally hurt other people. One of the things that we want to let you know is that next Sunday, we're going to be trying to offer more classes for more ages in church here. We're going to have a second adult class starting. We'll continue to have a class here in the auditorium. We'll continue to stream it. It's going to be focused on 1 Thessalonians. Stephen Corbett will be teaching a discussion-based class. It's going to happen in the chapel. And it will not be streamed. And so if you want to be there for that, we encourage you to join us in person. We'll talk more about that in the coming week, but we want you to know while this series is ending, adult Bible classes are going to be continuing. So thank you for joining us, and we'll gather together for worship in just a few minutes.
Thanks.